June 1942. Somewhere in the South Pacific, a U.S. submarine lines up a perfect shot. An enemy freighter, dead in the water, a clean kill. The crew holds their breath. Fire one, fire two. Two white trails cut through the ocean, then nothing. No explosion, no plume, just silence. Inside the submarine, disbelief. The captain slams his fist against the periscope. The torpedoes had struck but failed to explode. Again, across the Pacific, in Tokyo's Naval Command, officers laugh. "America's fish cannot swim," one Japanese admiral reportedly joked. The Imperial Navy considered American submarines little more than steel coffins armed with unreliable toys. But the irony of war is cruel. Those same broken torpedoes once mocked would one day deliver a blow so devastating, so haunting, that even victory felt like tragedy. And at the center of it all was one man, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine I-58. The man who would change the course of naval history and carry its guilt for the rest of his life. Japanese Navy laughed at America's broken torpedoes. Then everything sank. The U.S. Navy entered World War II with supreme confidence in its technology. Its submarines were modern. Its torpedoes, the Mark 14, were supposed to be the deadliest underwater weapon on Earth. It could dive deeper, run faster, and strike smarter, using a revolutionary magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath an enemy ship's keel. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was a disaster. American submariners quickly learned that their fish either ran too deep, exploded too early, or didn't explode at all. Some circled back and hit the very subs that fired them. The Pacific's deadliest hunters had become their own worst enemy. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, was furious. He once said, "If the Bureau of Ordnance were on this boat, I'd make every one of them go out and fire those DMN torpedoes themselves." It wasn't exaggeration. Lives were being lost because of bureaucratic pride. Meanwhile, Japanese submariners looked on and laughed. To them, America's failure proved divine superiority, that Japan's warriors, not America's machines, ruled the seas. And for a time, they were right. Japan's torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, were masterpieces of engineering, oxygen-fueled, silent, and lethal from 20,000 yards away. In 1942, it was Japan's Navy that ruled the Pacific, and America that floundered in the depths. But war has a way of flipping fortunes faster than anyone expects. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japan's submarines were ghosts in the ocean, vast, long-ranged, and deadly. While Germany's U-boats prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, Japan's subs were the ocean's lone hunters, massive vessels built not to strangle supply lines, but to shadow fleets and strike capital ships. Among these crews was a young officer from Kyoto, Mochitsura Hashimoto. Quiet, disciplined, and deeply traditional, Hashimoto was not the swaggering type. He revered the emperor, believed in the Bushido Code, and carried the heavy expectation that Japan's divine mission was unstoppable. But even he sensed the war's beginning was too glorious to last. Japan's submarine strategy mirrored its arrogance. Instead of attacking merchant convoys like the Germans, they used their subs as scouts to watch and wait for fleet engagements. When the opportunity came, they struck and struck hard. Japanese submarines claimed stunning early victories. The I-19 sank the USS Wasp and badly damaged the North Carolina and O'Brien with just 6 torpedoes. The USS Yorktown, crippled after Midway, was finished off by a Japanese sub, and for a brief, shining moment, Japanese Naval Command believed their undersea hunters were untouchable. Hashimoto served aboard several boats in these glory days, learning navigation, discipline, and silence. He watched older commanders return to port to fanfare and celebration. But even then, the cracks were forming. Japanese subs spent weeks on reconnaissance missions, while US convoys sailed largely unmolested. Japan had the skill, the technology, and the nerve, but not the strategy. While German U-boats strangled Britain, Japan let American logistics breathe a fatal mistake that would come back to haunt them. By 1943, the Imperial Navy's silent service had begun to fade into silence for real. All the while, America's broken torpedoes were being fixed and turned loose. By mid-1943, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. What once were hunting grounds for the Imperial Navy had become killing zones, patrolled by radar-equipped destroyers and aircraft armed with sonar-guided depth charges. The mighty Japanese submarines, once symbols of technological pride, were now slow, blind leviathans stalked from above and below. Commander Hashimoto, now seasoned and scarred by years of sea patrols, found himself on a new command, the I-58. She was powerful, long-range, equipped with Type 95 torpedoes, and capable of carrying the terrifying new invention Japan called kaiten, manned suicide torpedoes. But even before he took her to sea, Hashimoto could sense the change. The officers were younger, the eyes in their faces more desperate than proud. Fuel shortages crippled Japan's ability to train or patrol. Submarines sometimes left harbor without enough diesel to return. Their once formidable radio networks fell silent under relentless American code-breaking. And worst of all, the Pacific itself seemed to have turned against them, thick with American destroyers whose radar could track a periscope at miles of distance. Meanwhile, the Americans had finally solved, to their great shame. After 2 years of fury and field tests, the Mark 14 torpedo was reborn. Its depth control recalibrated, its detonator redesigned. It now struck true. Within months, U.S. submarines began to tear through Japan's merchant fleet like wolves among lambs. Oil tankers, troop transports, and supply convoys vanished beneath the waves. Japan's empire, spread wide across the Pacific, started to suffocate. For Hashimoto and his fellow captains, the laughter had stopped. No longer were they the hunters of Pearl Harbor's legend. They were men running out of air, food, and faith. Desperation birthed the Kaiten program. Human torpedoes piloted by young men promised eternal honor. But honor was a fragile thing in the dying days of 1944. Hashimoto, now in command of I-58, trained with these kaiten pilots. He watched them climb into their one-man steel coffins, smiling through fear, saluting before the hatches sealed. They sang farewell songs that echoed through the harbor. He admired their courage, but inside, he feared their sacrifice was useless. Japan wasn't fighting to win anymore. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Late July, 1945. The war was all but over, though few at sea knew it yet. American carriers ruled the skies. Japan's fleet was shattered, its airfields bombed to dust, its cities burning. But out on the Pacific, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto still had orders, and he intended to follow them to the letter. The I-58, his submarine, slipped silently from Kure Harbor under the cover of night. Her hull creaked with age. Her crew, weary, underfed, but loyal, carried a strange cargo. 6 kaiten suicide torpedoes and a small supply of conventional Type 95 seconds. Hashimoto's mission was simple: intercept American shipping between Guam and Leyte. But beneath that order lay a darker truth. This was likely a one-way voyage. Hashimoto faced a moral crossroads. He could use the kaiten, send 6 young men to certain death for a symbolic strike, or he could rely on his standard torpedoes and fight the old-fashioned way. He chose the latter. "The sea itself will claim enough men without our help," he told his XO quietly. For days, the I-58 prowled the Mariana Trench hunting, waiting. Then, on the moonlit night of July 29th, radar picked up a massive silhouette cutting across the dark horizon. Hashimoto raised his periscope. There it was, a heavy cruiser, alone, slicing through the waves at 17 knots. He didn't know its name, only that it was an American warship. That ship was the USS Indianapolis, fresh from delivering the most secret cargo of the entire war, the uranium and components for the atomic bomb that would soon fall on Hiroshima. But to the men aboard, their mission was over. They were heading home. No escort, no air cover, no idea death was watching from below. Hashimoto's breath fogged the eyepiece of his periscope as he tracked her. He ordered the submarine to close to 1,500 meters, dangerously close. Fire 1, then 5 more. 6 torpedoes left the tubes, racing silently through the black Pacific. At 12:14 a.m., the first struck the bow. Seconds later, another hit midship, right into the fuel tanks. The Indianapolis shuddered violently. Her deck lights went dark. Men were thrown from their bunks. Some thought they'd hit a mine. But within 12 minutes, the proud, heavy cruiser broke in half and disappeared beneath the waves. Hashimoto remained at periscope depth, watching the horror unfold through the trembling glass. No cheering, no shouts of victory. Just quiet awe and a single thought that would haunt him forever. We have done our duty. But what have we done? What Hashimoto didn't know was that this attack, this single, fateful volley, would trigger one of the greatest naval tragedies in American history. Because for the men of the Indianapolis, the nightmare was only beginning. The sea was calm that night, too calm. When the Indianapolis went under, it took more than 300 men with her. Around 900 sailors were left adrift in the open ocean, scattered across miles of dark water, clinging to debris, fuel slicks, and each other. No distress call had been received. No one knew they were gone. The first night, the survivors tried to stay together, calling names, tying their belts and life vests into desperate human chains. But as hours turned into days, dehydration, exposure, and hallucination tore them apart. Salt water burned their throats, the tropical sun cooked their skin, and then came the sharks. They came at dawn, sleek, grey shadows circling the helpless men. At first, they went for the floating corpses. Then, as hunger rose, they began attacking the living. Survivors would hear a scream, then silence, and the sound of thrashing in the distance. One sailor later said, "They'd hit us from below. Just tug and pull. You'd never see them, only the blood." It went on for 4 days. 900 men had entered the water. When rescue planes finally spotted the survivors purely by chance, only 316 were alive. Back in Japan, Commander Hashimoto filed his patrol report with quiet efficiency. He had no idea what he'd struck. To him, it was another target, one of hundreds sunk in the Pacific. But when word reached Tokyo that it had been a heavy cruiser, the propaganda machines celebrated, a rare victory in a collapsing war. The Navy command even called it divine justice for the firebombing of Tokyo, yet Hashimoto felt no pride. He later wrote, "There was no joy aboard I-58, only the weary sense that another chapter had closed." Even his crew, hardened by years of war, fell silent. The ocean had become a graveyard for both sides. For the Americans, the tragedy was unthinkable. The Indianapolis's mission had been top secret, her route unreported. It took 4 days before anyone even noticed she was missing an oversight that would stain the Navy's record for decades. When the survivors were pulled from the sea, their stories shocked the world. Men who had endured sharks, starvation, and madness, abandoned by their own command. But the Navy needed someone to blame, and they found their man. Captain Charles McVay III, the Indianapolis's commander, was court-martialed. The charge, failing to zigzag to avoid enemy submarines. Even though no distress call had been sent, even though no escort had been assigned, McVay became the scapegoat for a disaster no man could have prevented. And halfway across the world, the man who sank his ship, Mochitsura Hashimoto, was about to be called into an American courtroom. The war was over. Japan lay in ruins, her cities smoldering, her navy scattered, her emperor now a voice on the radio urging surrender. The once feared I-58 rested in Kure Harbor, battered and silent. Her captain, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, was summoned not to battle but to judgment. In late 1945, he stood in an American courtroom in Washington, D.C., facing a sight few soldiers in history could imagine. The surviving crew of the USS Indianapolis and Captain Charles McVay, the man whose ship he had sent to the bottom of the sea. McVay was being tried by his own Navy for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. It was a hollow charge, born of embarrassment, politics, and grief. The U.S. Navy, humiliated by its own communication failures, needed a symbol to restore public confidence, so they chose a scapegoat. But Hashimoto refused to play that role. He had been called as a witness, an enemy commander brought across the Pacific to testify. When he entered the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Some survivors glared, others looked away. Reporters wrote of the moment, a former foe bowed before his enemy, yet what he said stunned everyone. Through an interpreter, Hashimoto stated calmly, "Captain McVay could have done nothing to avoid my attack. The visibility was poor and our position was hidden. Even if he had zigzagged, I would have hit him." It was the truth spoken by the very man who had sunk the ship. But truth wasn't what the Navy wanted. They wanted closure. They wanted blame. McVay was convicted, the only U.S. Navy captain court-martialed for losing a ship in combat during World War II. His career was over. Though later reinstated, he never truly recovered. The letters from angry families never stopped. Some wrote him weekly. Year after year, he carried their grief as if he had survived the wreck himself. Hashimoto, meanwhile, returned to Japan a quiet man. He resumed his life, taught at a naval academy, and prayed often at shrines. When he spoke of the war, it was not with pride, but sorrow. He once said, "When I met Captain McVay, I saw in his eyes what I felt in my own heart. We were both victims of the same ocean." But fate had one final cruelty left to deliver. In November 1968, more than 2 decades after that night, Captain McVay walked into his garden, placed his Navy-issued revolver to his head, and ended his life. In his hand was a small toy sailor, a memento from his days of command. His dog sat beside him when neighbors found him. Hashimoto, upon hearing the news, wept. He sent condolences to McVay's family and prayed for his spirit. 2 men, enemies by duty, now forever linked by the same wave of history. Years passed, and the sea that had swallowed the Indianapolis grew calm again. But for the men who had lived through that night, and for the man who had caused it, the ocean never forgot. In the decades after the war, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto lived a life that could only be described as haunted peace. He moved quietly through post-war Japan, teaching navigation, writing, visiting shrines, and helping rebuild what the war had destroyed. He never boasted of his wartime service. When younger officers asked about the Indianapolis, he would pause, look out at the horizon, and say softly, "It was the saddest victory of my life." Hashimoto never escaped the irony that defined his story. At the beginning of the war, Japan had mocked American torpedoes as broken toys. By the end, it was America's torpedoes that crippled Japan's empire, sank her merchant fleet, and brought starvation to her islands. Those broken fish became the silent architects of Japan's defeat. And the torpedoes that once symbolized American failure, they were the same kind that carried death to the Indianapolis, the same that sealed the fate of hundreds of sailors and bound 2 captains in shared tragedy. In 1999, more than 50 years after the sinking, the United States Congress finally exonerated Captain Charles McVay. Survivors of the Indianapolis, by then old men with weathered faces and trembling hands, stood before cameras and said the words they'd waited a lifetime to say. He was not to blame. McVay's name was cleared, his record restored. But he never lived to see it. As for Hashimoto, he died in 1994, at the age of 91. He had lived long enough to see his country rise again, this time not through conquest, but through peace and perseverance. At his funeral in Kyoto, naval veterans came quietly, bringing folded flags and photographs. Among the flowers lay a single, weathered Navy insignia sent anonymously by an American veteran. It bore one simple inscription, "For a sailor who told the truth." The story of the Indianapolis and the I-58 is not one of heroes and villains. It is a story of duty, of men who obeyed orders, who fought as they were told, and who bore the consequences that followed. It is a reminder that even beneath the greatest oceans, honor and tragedy can exist in the same breath. Because the sea has no sides, it takes without judgment, and it remembers everything. The Pacific today is a serene, endless blue, but beneath those calm waves lie ghosts, iron and bone, pride and sorrow, resting in silence at the bottom of the sea. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis was finally found in 2017, nearly 72 years after her last voyage. She rests more than 18,000 feet down, her broken hull blanketed in silt and coral, still bearing the wounds from Hashimoto's torpedoes. The I-58 too is long gone, scuttled by her own navy, swallowed by the same waters that claimed her prey. 2 ships, 2 nations, 1 tragedy. In the end, the story of America's broken torpedoes and Japan's invincible submarines is not about who won or who lost, it's about what war does to the men who fight it. Technology failed, pride crumbled, but duty remained. And somewhere between the hunter and the hunted, humanity flickered briefly, painfully, beautifully. Hashimoto once wrote in his memoir, "The sea has no malice. It merely reflects the hearts of the men who fight upon it." Perhaps that's why his story endures, because it isn't just about a sinking, or a courtroom, or a weapon that finally worked. It's about what it means to live with the weight of doing one's duty, even when duty breaks you. So, when the ocean turns quiet and sonar pings echo faintly through the deep, maybe that's history calling back. Not in anger, not in victory, but in remembrance. Because the ocean never forgets. It keeps its secrets and its sorrows forever.